Hi everyone, okay, this is game 20 of the 1990 World Championship match between the famous rivals Garry Kasparov and Anatoli Karpov. Karpov became the world champion when Bobby Fischer was stripped of his title in 1975. He defended his title twice, both times against Viktor Korchnoi, and held on to it for 10 years until he lost it to the 22-year-old Garry Kasparov in 1985. Excluding Bobby Fischer, who had disappeared into obscurity, they were the best players in the world and very evenly matched. Kasparov defended his title against Karpov on 3 occasions, in 1986, 87 and 1990, and he won each meet, but only very narrowly. Karpov's style was very positional and similar to that of the great Capablanca. Along with Bobby Fischer, his technique was the closest to that of modern chess engines. When this game was played, the score in the match was 10-9 to Kasparov, who needed to get to 12.5 in order to retain his title, and with this win he effectively sealed the deal, and in great style. He opened with e4, after which came e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop b5, which is going into the Rue Lopez, sometimes called the Spanish game or the Spanish torture, because if played correctly by white it takes a very long time for black to equalize. Now came some normal opening moves with a6, bishop a4, knight f6, white castle, and bishop e7, which is going into the closed variations as opposed to taking on e4 with the knight. Rook e1, b5, bishop b3, d6, c3, Karpov castled, h3, and bishop b7 from Karpov, which is the Zaitsev variation, which was a favorite of his throughout his career. The main idea behind it is to apply more pressure to e4, and the play often becomes very sharp and tactical, as happened in this game. So play continued along the book lines with d4, rook e8, knight b d2, bishop f8, a4, h6, bishop c2, e takes d4, c takes d4, and Kasparov gets a strong, mobile pawn center, but despite that, white is still only slightly better. Then came knight b4, bishop b1, c5, and d5, which reduces the scope of this bishop on b7, and knight d7, which is preparing to push the f-pawn forward and gain more space on the king side, try and undermine white's pawns a bit. And rook a3 from Kasparov, which is a modern looking move, and the idea is to swing the rook over to the semi-open e-file, both to support the somewhat weak pawn on e4 and to have strong control of the e-file once the game opens up. f5, rook ae3, knight f6, and knight h2, which is the last book move, and Kasparov is offering a pawn here because Karpov can now play f takes e4, and after knight takes e4, knight f takes d5. But Karpov was well known for declining sacrifices, and the opening of the game that it involves here would almost definitely favor white as opposed to black. So king h8 is what Karpov did play, and then came b3 from Kasparov, which prepares to fianchetto the dark squared bishop, and also saves the queen from being tied down to the defense of the pawn on a4. Kasparov had other plans for her, as you'll see later. So then came b takes a4, b takes a4, and c4. And provoking this weakening move was perhaps another idea behind playing b3 earlier. Now black can create connected pass pawns by taking on e4, and this is what happens in the game, but the opening of the position definitely favors white, and what we're seeing here is a very cunning positional trap from Kasparov. Naturally, having connected pass pawns is a huge and often game-winning asset, especially if you win a pawn making them along the way. And it's so much the case, they're so strong that their allure can blind a player to the dynamics of the position as a whole. And here even Karpov, the brilliant positional player and famous sacrifice decliner, cannot resist the bait. And taking the pawn on c4 here for Kasparov with knight takes c4 would favour black, because after f takes e4, if bishop takes e4, then knight takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, knight takes d5, and the pawn is regained, and Karpov would have a strong bishop pair and reasonable chances of winning the endgame. So Kasparov naturally didn't go in for that and played instead, after c4, bishop b2, and then came f takes e4, which is the first step towards creating the connected pass pawns. But as I said, the opening of the game definitely favours white. So knight takes e4 and knight f takes d5. Now you see the two pawns are connected. Well, they're not quite connected, but you know, they can be connected in the future. And it's interesting that Karpov decided to take with that knight. Perhaps better here was knight b takes d5, but Karpov presumably wanted to avoid the weakening of his king side, and in particular the creation of two isolated pawns that would now come with knight takes f6, rook takes e3, rook takes e3, and g takes f6. If instead knight takes f6, then either knight g4 or queen c2 would favour white strongly. So knight f takes d5 is what Karpov played anyway. And then came rook g3, which is a move that Fritz didn't like, preferring instead queen h5, which is threatening to take on h6, and the best defense here for black is to give up the exchange with the rook e5, but he wins it back again after bishop takes e5, d takes e5, knight g4, and knight takes e3. But now comes knight takes e5, and white is definitely better. And you know, in a world championship match, this kind of play is fairly unlikely, and it makes sense that Kasparov went for the safer option with his rook g3 move. So then came rook e6 and knight g4. And suddenly white is getting very active piece play as compensation for his sacrificed pawn, with all of his pieces well placed and coordinated for a strong kingside attack. And queen e8 is what Karpov played now, which is perhaps to avoid some of the tactics that could come about if he played something instead like knight f4, because now can come knight e f6, where best play continues, rook takes e1 and queen takes e1, with advantage to white, due especially to the very strong knight on f6 and a powerful attack coming soon. And the knight's of course immune if g takes f6 and bishop takes f6 wins the queen and the game. So queen e8 from Karpov. Now came knight takes h6, which is a strong sacrifice that Karpov as usual declines and instead finds the strongest response. Let's have a quick look at what happens if he accepts. He can't take with the g-pawn because it's pinned by the bishop here on b2, so it would have to be rook takes h6, but now comes knight takes d6, and black's best hope is to take the rook with queen takes e1. But after queen takes e1, rook takes d6, queen e4, white definitely has a big advantage, and if Karpov had held on to the queen instead at, where are we now? At this stage, if he played queen d7, now would come queen g4 with a big advantage to white. If queen takes g4, then knight f7 check, king g8, knight takes h6 check, king h8. If g takes h6, then rook takes g4 check, king f7, bishop g6 check, king g8, bishop f5 with discovered check, king f7, bishop e6 check, king e8, bishop takes d5 check, king d7, bishop takes b7, and white is easily winning. So king h8, but now knight takes g4, and again white is winning. The exchange in a pawn up is going to be a matter of simple technique. Okay, that's the end of part 1.